Paper was like gold in medieval times.
Oh, not tobacco. Sugar.
That everything we thought we knew about the world might turn out to be completely wrong.
It's one of the greatest stories never told.
From the very start, we thought it was an inside job.
Who stole over $5 million of Kerry Packer's gold?
Very brazen to break into the office of Australia's richest man.
All the evidence pointed to one man.
This is a fellow who didn't have any apparent income, yet lived in a $1 million apartment in Wallara.
Investigative crime reporter Adam Shand goes on the trail.
It's about loyalty, betrayal and revenge.
And uncovers why nailing the chief suspect
He just suddenly went quiet.
became mission impossible for the police.
One of the best crooks I've ever had to work on.
This is the third floor of 54 Park Street, Sydney, the headquarters of the Packer family empire for 7 decades until they sold out in 2007. From here, Kerry Packer presided over his powerful magazine and television empire. He hatched World Series cricket and struck fear into the hearts of his staff. It was a formidable seat of power in Australia. This boardroom was where Kerry Packer's office used to be. There were very few who got the better of him in this inner sanctum. But tonight we tell the story of someone who did. In April 1995, there was 283 kilos of gold bullion worth about 5.4 million hidden in a safe that used to sit about here in the office. One night it disappeared and no one has ever been charged. But as you'll see, this is not just a story about missing gold. It's about loyalty, betrayal and revenge.
It was a Monday morning, and as much as that seems funny to remember this many years ago, you don't forget matters that relate to Australia's richest man. I was in the office and a phone call came in. It was from a colleague from the City Central Command who knew the work that we did and knew that we'd be quite interested in knowing about the fact that nearly 300 kilos of gold had been stolen from the office of Kerry Packer at Australian Consolidated Press.
You went to the office there. What scene confronted you?
Well, there's very little to see in terms of identifying the crime. There was a safe had been cut within the office of Mr. Packer. My recollection was that it was a very old Chubb safe. You had only known about an incident because of a mark that was on the carpet.
What was the mark on the carpet?
A burn mark. So there'd been something, to our thinking, had dropped onto the floor during the process of the safe being cut open by the offender.
Given that there was just a small cut and the door was open and obviously been successfully attacked, what was your impression of the handiwork of the safe cutter?
That it was a very neat cut and very targeted. It had hit exactly the right spot within that safe to effect entry in a minimal manner.
It was an old safe from the 1940s, an easy target for an experienced safe cutter.
Was there anything on the scene at that stage apparent to you that indicated a suspect initially?
No. Once the crime scene was identified, normal course, we would use all the forensic evidence available to us, and fingerprints was an important one. So our fingerprint expert dusted the safe and was able to identify a print within the internals of the safe.
That was something that we could work on, was this fingerprint. And we were informed by the fingerprint department that it was a fresh fingerprint. So we made inquiries as to the owner of the fingerprint, and he was a young safe mechanic. So we thought, well, a safe mechanic knows how to get into us. Safe. So we started making inquiries in relation to this young mechanic. Then we had to go over and interview him, and he was living in Adelaide. Him and his wife were very religious. His parents were very religious. His mother actually kept a diary as part of her religious faith. She used to write down everything every day. And the weekend of the robbery, she had written in it, they were all in Adelaide, and her car had broken down, and this young mechanic had to go and organise to get Mum's car fixed up. And he was the most unlikeliest safe breaker you could ever meet in your life.
And as it turned out, this individual had worked for Chubb and many years earlier attended Mr Packer's office and conducted some repairs to the safe. When the safe was cut open, causing the air within the safe to heat up and moisture to form on the steel surfaces, that moisture adhered to the oils that had been left on this fingerprint. And when dusted, it gave it the appearance of being a very fresh fingerprint, when it had indeed been there for a number of years.
So strike that one off the list.
Unfortunately, yes.
Then the investigation took another turn.
Mr Packer receives a letter from an extortionist who says, I know where the gold is. If you don't give me $200,000, you won't get the gold, but I'll also blow up the children's hospital.
Yes, yes.
The court hearing was told that Henderson wrote to Kerry Packer on May 17, claiming to know where gold bullion stolen from a safe in the media magnate's Sydney office was stashed. It's alleged Henderson threatened to bomb Sydney's Children's Hospital or a major suburban institution in Melbourne if his demands weren't met. Undercover police were called in and received instructions to go to a car park near the motel and leave the cash in a bag on the road. Minutes later, the money was collected.
He wasn't what you'd call one of the smartest crooks going around, and he was arrested.
Detectives from Sydney's major crime squad charged Melvin Lawrence Henderson with demanding money with menaces.
He was just an opportunist.
Yes, he created an opportunity to go to jail instead.
Correct.
So, 2 false starts for the police. And our investigation has uncovered another twist. When the gold heist was discovered, the South Region Major Crime Squad weren't the only police to attend the crime scene. There were delicate discussions taking place, a long way above their pay grade. And another senior policeman was summoned to Park Street.
I got a call from an attorney who was a close confidant of Kerry Packer's, who told me about what had occurred at Packer's office and asked me would I go and investigate it.
This wasn't John Burke's case. He was the inspector in charge of the Waverley district, a desk job, so he normally didn't go out on matters like this.
When I got there, I saw that his vault had been attacked. In actual fact, as soon as I saw it, I took an educated guess at who had done it. Well, it appeared to me that the vault had been cut with a thermal lance, and I only knew of one individual who had the expertise to use such a device, and he had done it many, many years before.
I gather you ventured this name, Mr X we're calling him, to Kerry Packer. And what was his reaction when you said, I think it's Mr X had done this?
Well, he immediately surprised me by saying, well, he knew him. And it went on from there that he had regularly dined at a restaurant at King's Cross where he had met Mr X. He then went on to tell me that he knew that he was living in a block of units in the eastern suburbs. And domiciled in that building also was a former employee of his.
Pat Wheatley. Did that arouse Kerry Packer's suspicion?
Well, I can only presume so, because he then went on to say that she'd been made redundant and it left a very sour note with her.
This is Wallara in Sydney's eastern suburbs, a ritzy postcode of mansions and foreign embassies. Here in this flash apartment block lived Mr. X, long known as one of Sydney's best safecrackers. Here also lived Mr. Packer's former private secretary, Pat Wheatley, in the flat above. How the South Region Major Crime Squad came across this information is a matter of some speculation. Was it via John Burke or Kerry Packer himself? We'll never know. But there were sensitive matters at play here. Pat Wheatley had given Kerry Packer the best years of her life. Now she was a suspect in robbing him.
We found out that Mr. X lived on the bottom floor and Mr. Packer's ex-secretary lived on the first floor. And it took a while before we found out that they actually knew one another.
And you had an observation post there in Wallara looking down on the building.
We had surveillance on him, and the more we looked into Mr. X, the better it got.
Then you discover there may have been a deeper relationship between Mr. X and Pat Wheatley. How far did it go, did you discover?
He spent a lot of time on the phone. Just about all his time that he was in his unit, he'd be on the phone. And during one of these phone conversations, he told somebody he was visiting Pat Wheatley upstairs.
So, Janet, what have you found out about the relationship between Mr. X and Pat Wheatley?
Well, they obviously had a relationship. They obviously were lovers because the police had been following him around. They had him under surveillance the whole time. They may have been long-term lovers. They had a very close relationship. They slept together.
All roads lead back to Patricia Wheatley. How many times did you speak to her?
We conducted a formal interview in her solicitor's office.
And who was that?
Malcolm Turnbull.
Formidable lawyer.
Yes.
Soon to be eventually Prime Minister.
Correct.
And what was the tone of those inquiries? Was she willing to assist?
Well, she wanted to assist, but she was very guarded in what she would disclose. Whilst she was not unhelpful, she wasn't helpful.
It was about here that Pat Wheatley sat. She was Kerry's gatekeeper, and her dominion began just outside his office. She was never married, she was married to her job. For nearly 20 years, she managed Kerry's personal affairs, his travel itinerary, and kept his secrets. Above all, the Packers valued loyalty and secrecy, and they rewarded it lavishly. But things began to change in the early 1990s, and this ultimate insider was shown the door. Wheatley was given a generous pension for life, which included a property and cash. But the sting of rejection stayed with her. There's perhaps a lesson in this story. It pays to be careful how you handle someone who knows where you hide your gold. She knew the gold was there.
She certainly did. She was working for Mr. Packer when he sold a mine in Western Australia, and he wanted the payment in gold bars, not cash. And she was there when the gold bars were delivered and put in his safe.
How many people were aware that there was gold in the safe?
Before it happened? I'd never heard it.
When Richard Walsh ran Packer's publishing empire in the 1990s, loyalty was everything.
Kerry and his father before him, Frank, had required and rewarded loyalty.
Yes. Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
And Pat Wheatley had been a good secret keeper. She'd worked for Billy McMahon before that.
Yes, I mean, Kerry told me All his attempts to wheedle, to cajole, to bribe, to muscle out of her some of Billy McMahon. He knew Billy McMahon had more than a few secrets, and he had tried to get some of this out of Pat. The way he told it to me was total nil success. And he was so impressed with this, he basically, I guess, thought that all his secrets were in her vault and would never come out.
What kind of person was Pat Wheatley?
I liked Pat. You had to be on the right side of her. Fortunately, I don't think I ever had an argument with her or got on the wrong side of her, but I saw people who did. It was ugly. She relied on me for something that she didn't rely on too many people for, because Kerry, by the end of the day, was someone who was a bit ropey, and there was a tradition that around 5:30, 6 o'clock, we had guests from outside. And she always felt that I could get Kerry into a good mood more than anyone else could.
How would you do that, Richard?
Told him jokes. And she knew that if she rang me and said, "I think we really need you down here tonight," that I would do that.
And that indicates the closeness of their relationship, as she could anticipate his needs and you could be the solution to a problem.
So there was an exchange. Sometimes I had something that I needed to pass by him that I thought might inflame him. A magazine's figures mightn't be up to scratch, or someone who he valued might need to be moved sideways or whatever. I'd say, "I've got something. When you come in, can you tell me what the weather's like?" And she would ring up and sort of say, "It's raining." She would ring me every couple of hours to give me a weather report, and whether she thought the sunshine would ever come out today or whether we would have to try for another day.
We're investigating the theft of Kerry Packer's gold. The police suspected Kerry's former personal secretary, Pat Wheatley, might have been in league with Mr X in 1995. But we need to go back further to 1990 to understand the chain of events that may have turned Wheatley against her former boss.
Good evening. Millionaire businessman Kerry Packer is in intensive care tonight after suffering a massive heart attack.
Everything changed in the Packer empire in 1990 after Kerry collapsed while playing polo. He was revived despite being clinically dead for 7 minutes.
Once he'd had that incident on the polo field, he was never quite the man that he once was. And so, a lot of the life force and energy had gone out of him. He was trying to get things into shape for James to take over. He wasn't sure of his own longevity at that time.
Packer's answer to the challenge of succession was to bring in a brash American CEO, Al Dunlap, to mentor his son James. Dunlap was known as Chainsaw, but he preferred Rambo in pinstripes. Whatever the nickname, the intent was clear.
It was a reign of terror, wasn't it, going on then?
Yeah, I could write a book about the reign of terror from my experience of working for Al Dunlap. It gave me a real insight into how those things work. One of the people who did survive Al, Bill Cook, put out a limited edition T-shirt that said, "I work for Al Dunlap and survived." And I think there was a limited edition of 5 or 6 copies. I certainly have one at home. He had really kind of swayed through the senior management, and by 1995, I think we were all little islands because the company had changed so dramatically.
The reign of terror is on. The axe even falls on loyal Pat Wheatley.
She, of course, famously loved to drink. I mean, part of her undoing was Al Dunlap found that she had a secret cupboard I thought was actually a secret meeting room. I knew it was a door that we'd never seen open. I just assumed it went into some secret little bit. But it was apparently a very large cellar where she had stored over the years an enormous amount of very handy liquor. Al discovered this, got all furious about it. She was hurled out. Probably given a lot of money, but you know, this was her life. I mean, people always forget that with work. I mean, work is two things. It's a source of money and a source of personal fulfillment. She wasn't married, she had no children. She came in, she sat at that desk, she was queen when she was sitting there, she was Kerry's confidant. When he went off to the casino, she carried the money in a suitcase kind of thing. She held all his secrets. That made her, that was her life. So if she felt vengeful, and I'm not saying she did, but if she felt vengeful, she had every reason. Al had destroyed her life.
Kerry did nothing to prevent that.
No.
Al Dunlap may have been the one to sack Wheatley, but she blamed Packer.
Were you aware that she'd been fired and that she was quite resentful of that, and that she'd been loyal to him for a long time, and she felt that loyalty had not been returned? And did you know that?
No, I knew that she'd been fired because of her drinking problem, but no, I didn't know she had a grudge against him because he looked after her very well. I suppose there might have been a bit of resentment there because he dismissed her.
When police confronted Wheatley about the theft, she had Malcolm Turnbull by her side as her solicitor. And due to a confidentiality agreement, she was under strict orders to say nothing about the Packers' business. And Kerry Packer wasn't exactly forthcoming either. To police, at times, it seemed like they were facing a wall of secrecy. She was not being open with the police. What did that lead you to believe?
We asked her, did you tell Mr. X about the gold? She denied that. She said no. So we assume that she's inadvertently told him during their relationship, or deliberately told him, we don't know. And he's taken advantage of it.
We're on the trail of Kerry Packer's stolen gold. Now remember John Burke, who also attended the scene at Park Street? He was certain this was the handiwork of Mr. X. And the reason why he was certain was because of the way the safe had been cut. Now, I have my doubts about that, so I need to find out more. How had you known Mr. X? What's your background with him?
Oh, it goes back a long way, over many years. It goes back when I was a very, very young detective stationed at Darlinghurst. In the late 60s, he done the vault in what was then known as the Bank of New South Wales in William Street. I remember it was a long weekend. He must have been in there pretty well the entire weekend. And he thermal lanced the vault. And it was the first known thermal lance job in Australia. Anyway, he cleaned the vault out.
I know of only 2 attacks in my time, and they were both on banks.
Tell us about thermic lances. When did you first start to see them coming into Australia?
Okay, I was transferred to the breaking squad in 1968, and as part of your induction, they used to send you along to the Chubbs safe factory, and they used to put on demonstrations of the various ways in which safes could be attacked. And one of the demonstrations was the thermic lance. And what I noticed about it was that it was so noisy. You'd have to be in an isolated area or have the place soundproofed.
What made it so noisy?
I think it was the volume of oxygen which they blew through, and the tips of the lance operated at such a high temperature that it melted. In other words, they'd walk forwards, then they'd have to keep replacing the tip.
Given the demonstrations that I sat through, I'd find it astonishing if one floor above they didn't hear the heavy blowing that was taking place.
On the weekend when Kerry Packer's gold was stolen, I think you were in the building.
Yeah, I was working in the office because I did work on weekends. My office was right above Kerry's, so whatever was happening underneath my feet, underneath my chair.
Did you hear anything?
Not a thing.
It doesn't make sense. If a thermal lance was used, you are looking at absolute clouds, thick clouds of black, acrid smoke. If you're after the cash in the safe and you're using a thermal lance that's operating at 4,500 degrees Celsius, by the time you get into that safe, the cash in there is ash.
Our investigation has found someone who can tell us exactly what happened to Packer's safe.
So, Mark, tell us, how did you get involved in the case of Kerry Packer's gold getting stolen?
Well, we got a call out to Park Street that the safe had been cut open. And we go out there and sure enough, it was Kerry Packer's safe. And we pulled it out, took it downstairs to take it away.
Was it a safe like this, Mark?
Very similar to this.
We've got a picture of the safe after it was cut open, and you can see there's just one little scorch mark on the carpet. What does that tell you about the skill of the safe cutter?
Well, that tells you he knew exactly where he was cutting. There's one relocker in there. He would have missed the relocker and probably opened this safe in probably 10 minutes.
10 minutes. And so that little burn there would be from what, do you think?
That's just the hot steel falling onto the ground. But if he'd hit a relocker, he would have had to cut bigger holes, so the more steel falling on there, he would have burnt everywhere from there. But that shows you he did actually know what he was doing. You wouldn't go in there with oxyacetylene and not know what you were dealing with.
And there's no doubt in your mind that this is oxyacetylene?
That's oxyacetylene, yep.
What would a thermic lance?
Thermic lance, you've got to wear a full outfit. The heat generated out of that, you know, you'd scorch everything. Sites where they have used the thermal lance, the heat it generates is enormous. It stays hot for hours and hours inside. Everything would have been scorched.
John Burke was likely wrong that the safe was attacked with a thermal lance, but his opinion of Mr. X's skill was spot on.
As a safe cutter, he was always considered in the top 3 in the nation. As a criminal generally, he was very professional in what he did, to the point that he was rarely arrested.
Very determined crook by the sounds.
Well, if there are any good crooks, he was one of them.
OK, so the cops had Mr. X in their sights. They knew he was on close terms with Pat Wheatley, Kerry Packer's former secretary. Perhaps they're even sleeping together. Maybe he was playing a long game, and he knew the path to Kerry Packer's gold was through Pat Wheatley. But now the cops had to join the dots. So they had to step up their surveillance on Mr. X, but that wasn't going to be so easy with a wily operator like Mr. X.
He had a Ford utility, which the number plate, the engine number and the chassis was all in different people's names. He would never park the utility anywhere near the unit. He'd park it down the road and walk. He used to disappear. He'd walk in a block of units. We were waiting for him to come walk down the side where the front door was and go in the front door, but he never did. He disappeared down the other side and disappeared around the back. And we had no idea where he went to. Couldn't see any lights. He had the blinds and every window pulled down. When we eventually did a search of his unit, we found that he entered through the back kitchen door. The kitchen door was at the back. The only rooms he used were the kitchen, the lounge room where he used to sit, and the bedroom, and he had a gym. a workbench and some weights in one of the rooms. The other rooms he wouldn't use. And there was newspapers everywhere.
So the lifestyle was very basic, even Spartan.
He's very Spartan. He sat on the one part of the lounge and a coffee table in front of him where the phone was. And he would ring up people and you could hear him say, I'm at Hornsby now, or I'm at Sutherland, or I'm presently doing this or doing that. And he would sit in the lounge room. We tried to follow him one day, and he went all out through the inner west, through Sydenham, Petersham, Lewisham, drove everywhere.
He would take turns down dead-end streets and sit and then drive back out and continue on.
He eventually ended up at Sydney Airport, where the cargo section is. And he did all that anti-surveillance just to use a public phone that was inside the foyer.
What a frustrating guy to work on. He's 100% onto you. He's assuming that he's being under surveillance all the time.
He'd only been ever arrested once, and that was back in the early 70s. The breaking squad was doing a search on another safe breaker's house. And these safe breakers had broken into the Chubb factory at Waterloo there and were photographing and doing diagrams of all the old safes, the interior of them. And Mr. X had been photographed in the background without his knowledge. So when the breaking squad found these photographs, they went and arrested Mr. X.
So they got his fingerprints, they, got the mug shot, they had his rap sheet, and on his rap sheet, he told them about the tattoos that he had, and one of them, he said he had a tattoo on his penis, which was B&E, but he told them it actually read breaking and entering.
Just the initials or the full?
The full. He told them it spelled out the full breaking and entering. But yeah, he was a sort of a good crook.
Very cautious criminal. Only mistake he ever made in his whole career, would appear.
Well, not quite. We've discovered that Mr. X has convictions stretching back to the 1960s. In '64, he was convicted of breaking into the Japanese Trading Centre in Pitt Street, Sydney, and making off with £14,000 worth of cultured pearls. In March 1967, he's in Melbourne. He attacks the safe at the Windsor branch of the ES&A Bank and gets $41,000 in cash and valuables. They catch him for that too, and he does 2 years. When he gets out, he joins the exodus of Aussie thieves to London, where he turns up in the 1969 edition of Scotland Yard's Aussie Index of Crooks. I'm told that he blows a safe over there and takes out the wall of the building. Mr. X has managed to keep himself out of the public spotlight since the 1970s. But there's no one I've met who doesn't believe it was him who escaped with Packer's gold. We can reasonably deduct that he may have got a tip-off from Pat Wheatley, but apart from that assistance, did he act alone?
From the very start, we thought it was an inside job. Therefore, it was a bit of a taboo subject, really.
Very brazen to break into the office of Australia's richest man, go straight to a cupboard, open that cupboard, knowing the safe is in there, cut open a safe, take the gold and leave. And apart from the mark on the carpet, as I said, no other indication of a crime having been committed.
Cutting the safe was one thing, but you've got to get 283 kilos of gold out of the building.
Correct. We could find no evidence to how the gold was removed from the building. That remains one of those mysteries.
What was security like at ACP back in those days?
The security was incredibly slack. People signed a book, but it was pretty easy to walk in and look as though you owned the place. And in fact, there was a wonderful story. It shows how slack the security was. The stranger came into the building and rang a Lamborghini dealer and said that James was interested in buying a Lamborghini. Really keen, but he just wanted to do a test drive before buying it. Could they bring a Lamborghini round into the garage? And they did, and they were greeted by a man who said that James was very grateful. He would test drive it for the afternoon and let them know. The Lamborghini was never seen again.
We spent a lot of time investigating the security company and speaking to Mr. John Murray, who ran the security company. He said, go and speak to this particular security guard, he's got some information for you. So we met the security guard who no longer worked for Mr. Murray. He said the security gig at the ACP building was one of the best gigs going. Night shift, they spent it all in the gym and the swimming pool and the squash courts.
At the Hyde Park Club next door?
At the Hyde Park Club, which is, well, part of the ACP building, actually, and which the security guards had access to. So they basically were missing most of the night shift. So that, we thought, right, this is something else Mr. X might have known.
The robber had two challenges, getting into the building and then getting out with the gold. If Pat Wheatley had told Mr. X about the gold, she could have also told him about the security and their habit of playing squash at the gym next door. I've also been told that Mr. X was seen at least on one occasion outside Park Street doing surveillance. The next question. Once he's gained entry and cut the safe, how does he get out of the building unnoticed with 283 kilos of gold? What the police believe is that he wheeled the gold into this goods lift, which has been here for donkey's years, and took it down to the ground floor. Voila. It's a bit different now, but this is the loading dock at Park Street. Back in the day, only Kerry Packer parked his car in here, and that was only on the weekdays. The weekends, this loading dock was empty.
We assume he put a vehicle in the dock and come down the lift and just wheeled the gold straight in the back of the ute and taken off.
While the security guards had their sporting pursuits next door.
We're having a good time, yeah.
I mean, there were so many mysteries around the Packer family that as long as you looked like the boss said I could do this kind of stuff, that kind of might have, you didn't need a pass.
As you trundled out 300 kilos of gold.
He wants me to take his gold out for a bit of an airing. He's frightened it's going off.
The inquiry into the theft of Kerry Packer's gold was flatlining. The police knew about the relationship between Pat Wheatley and Mr. X. They had a theory that pillow talk might have opened up an opportunity for a rich payday for Mr. X, or that Pat Wheatley might have been involved in the theft as an act of revenge. But this was all circumstantial. They'd followed him round for weeks, but he'd given nothing away. It was time for a change of tactics.
I thought, we're getting nowhere with this inquiry. We've got to rattle the cage, as they say. So we'll just stop him in the middle of the street and just grab him and see what he's got to say. I had a conversation with him. He was very guarded, didn't say anything. Just let me do the talking. And I just happened to say to him, well, Mr. X, have a happy Christmas. We might be talking to you later. And he looked at me and said, that's up to you whether I have a happy Christmas or not. And sort of looked at me. Straight away, I knew. He was letting me know that I knew there was him.
And that's as close as you got?
That's as close as I got because he just suddenly went quiet. The phone conversation stopped. everything stopped. I suppose he got even more paranoid and he just ceased all activity.
And it was at that point, 9 months after the break-in, that police shut down the investigation.
My boss come and saw me and said, because no one's talking now and it's but getting towards a dead end, give it to the Crime Commission, and didn't go any further there either.
And what of Packer himself? If he was upset, he didn't show it. A few days after the robbery, he left for Las Vegas and reportedly won $15 million on the baccarat table. Later, he also claimed more than $5 million insurance on the stolen gold. The loss was more about trust than money, and the outrage that his inner sanctum had been breached. And what about Mr. X?
Was there any evidence of a change in lifestyle or anything that was significant that might have given you the idea that, yes, he's cashing in the gold somehow?
Not that I'm aware of, no. To the contrary, some 15 years later, I happened to be out at Sydney Airport for another investigation and observed a vehicle of the same make and model that we had seen our suspect in back in '95. This was a Ford.
A utility? Huh?
Yes. The registration had changed. I did even see an elderly male walking from the vehicle. It turned out to be our suspect. And if he got his hands on as much gold as we think he did, many years later, he's still his mode of transport hadn't changed, which I found a little surprising.
What's the point of all this? When you can't enjoy your ill-gotten gains, is it all about the cleverness, all about the, I got Kerry Packer's gold?
I suspect there's something about that, although I don't know who you tell. Maybe he didn't get the full value of the gold, but he got enough out of it that allowed him to continue living a pretty comfortable lifestyle. This is a fellow who didn't have any apparent income.
Never had a job.
Yet lived in $1 million apartment in Wallara. It's always the crooks that you don't hear of that are the much better crooks. They're not caught and they're not convicted.
Very cautious criminal.
Just a good crook. I mean, the fact that he...
One of the best crooks I've ever had to work on.
And he beat you?
Certainly did. Certainly did. Yes.
Pat Wheatley died in 2008, aged 64, without ever revealing what she knew about the gold heist or her tryst with Mr. X. He's the only one left who knows what happened to Kerry Packer's gold, and he's not talking, which is why he stayed one step ahead of the cops since they grabbed him for breaking into a safe factory back in the 70s. If you tell no one, there's no one you have to trust, which is probably the lesson that Kerry Packer learned out of all this. Mr. X just melted into the scenery after the robbery. He sold his Wallara apartment in 2013, and the agent managing the sale told me that it was strewn with dusty newspapers, and there were few other signs of habitation. It looked much as it did back in 1995. If Mr. X did steal $5 million worth of gold, he enjoyed it far beyond the view of New South Wales police.